History is full of shocking facts and stories, as we saw in the two earlier iterations of this new format, and now it's time to do it all over again, but with weird, wacky, and wondrous military facts. So let's not faff about and let's just get right into it, shall we? Number 1. Unsinkable Sam. Did you know that there was a sailor who served both with the German Kriegsmarine and the British Royal Navy during World War II? And as if that wasn't unlikely enough, they also survived the sinking of 3 separate ships in 1941, specifically the German battleship Bismarck in May, as well as the British destroyer HMS Cossack and aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal in October and November respectively. Now, when we say that, what kind of sailor do you have in mind? Perhaps a young fellow who found himself serving his Führer blindly until a chance encounter with a Mark 12 torpedo gave him pause to reconsider where his loyalties lie. An understandable assumption there, but ultimately it's an incorrect one. For you see, Sam was a cat. His service began on the 18th of May 1941 when Bismarck set sail for Operation Rheinenbong. Unfortunately for him, however, this wasn't an operation that went terribly well for the Bismarck, as the entire British home fleet descended upon her to deliver a firm shoeing. This promptly sent her bow first into the drink and onto the seabed. As a result of this, Sam found himself drifting on a section of wood paneling, Jack and Rose style, before he was scooped out of the water by the crew of the Cossack and made the ship's mouse catcher-in-chief. He was then saved again 5 months later when the Cossack was torpedoed by U-563, being scooped up by a fleeing sailor's hands before he leapt into a lifeboat. Sam then found himself on Ark Royal when his saviour received a new posting, only to end up clinging to another piece of wood when Ark Royal was torpedoed by U-81. He then spent a few years as chief mouser to the governor of Gibraltar before retiring to Belfast and passing away peacefully of old age in 1955. Number 2. Germ warfare. One thing movies don't tell you about soldiering is that all the adrenaline-pumping, PTSD-inducing stuff is actually just a tiny part of the gig, and that day-to-day being a soldier is pretty damn boring. There's lots and lots of marching up and down on the square, moving a ton of sandbags 6 feet to the left, or just being sat around in a forward operating base, staring at the clock and waiting for something to happen. This naturally leads to soldiers finding rather creative ways to kill time. I mean, they are human after all. And that brings us to the American aircraft carrier USS Enterprise in 1965, where the crew's boredom had hit such crushing depths that they opted to relieve it by creating a special one-off bomb to commemorate the 6 million pound of ordnance dropped on Vietnam, specifically a toilet bomb. And none of this is metaphorical, they literally created a toilet bomb. The toilet itself was pinched from one of the lower deck ablutions, stuffed full of explosives, and as you can see on the screen right now, it was outfitted with all the bits needed to be dropped from the pylons of a Douglas A-1H Sky Raider. The Sky Raider in question was 572 Paper Tiger, piloted by Commander Clarence W. Stoddard, and as he was catapulted from the Enterprise's deck, a rather perplexed air traffic controller could be heard calling out, "What the hell was on 572's right wing?" The answer to this can be found in Stoddard's flight log: 7 Mark 82 500-pound bombs and 1 Sani flush. Number 3. Japanese holdouts. Japan's surrender in World War II came on the 2nd of September 1945, but a few of its soldiers didn't quite get the message and kept on fighting, either because they believed the announcement of surrender to be an Allied ruse, felt bound by honor to never surrender, or were simply cut off from communications, so they never got the message. Most surrendered within a year or two, but some of them held out for way longer than you might first imagine, with some, such as Masashi Ito, Kinshichi Kazuka, and Teruo Nakamura, holding out until 1960, 1972, and 1974 respectively. Number 4. The most important piece of equipment in a tank. If we were to ask you to name the most important piece of equipment in a tank, what would spring to mind? Maybe the cannon, vital as it is for ruining the enemy's day and making sure you get home in one piece. Or maybe it's the radio, because after all, you can't underestimate the importance of communications on the modern battlefield. Ask that question to an American or Russian tanker, and they may very well be the answers you get. But ask a Brit and there is only one answer you'll receive, and that's the vessel boiling electric, or the BV for short. An item that in unbelievably stereotypical British fashion boils water on demand to keep the tea flowing. The device was an ingenious solution to a problem that had plagued the British Army throughout World War II. Tankers constantly stopping for a cheeky brew anywhere at any time. So prolific was this that it started to cause real problems on the tactical level, as no one, not even the fiercest regimental sergeant major, could stop a tankie from pulling up to exercise his God-given right to a lovely cup of tea. So, come the end of World War II and the introduction of the Centurion, the British Army just started fitting all of their tanks with the aforementioned BVs so that brews could be enjoyed on the move. They remain standard to this day and are taken so seriously that any vehicle with a defective BV is declared unfit for purpose and torn off the front lines. Number 5. The Soldier Bear. Wojtek was a Syrian brown bear bought as a cub by the soldiers of Polish Second Corps while serving in Iran in 1942. Initially, he was nothing but a cute unit mascot, but was soon formally enlisted in the unit, primarily so that the men of Second Corps could blag extra food for him and prevent him from being taken away by any fun sponge of a senior officer that may insist that a bear was too dangerous or unpredictable to be running around a war zone. But while he may have just enlisted for the benefits, Wojtek was every bit the competent and professional soldier, quickly learning to salute his superior officers, march on his hind legs beside the men, and load 100 pounds of crates of artillery shells onto the back of the trucks. For this diligence, and absolutely not because the men of Second Corps thought it was cute, he was promoted to the rank of corporal in 1943. But Wojtek didn't let his new position go to his head, and despite the lofty expectations of rank, he remained one of the boys and could often be found wrestling the men, drinking beer, and enjoying his favourite treat, cigarettes, which despite many witnesses insisting he smoked like a person, he likely just ate. Wojtek survived the war and was demobilized in 1945. He then settled into a well-earned retirement at Edinburgh Zoo and lived to the ripe old age of 21. And right to the very end, he would remember and salute his old comrades, particularly when they threw cigarettes into his enclosure. Number 6. The army that came back with more men than it sent. When the Austro-Prussian War broke out in 1866, Liechtenstein threw its hat into the ring and entered the war on the side of Austria. To this end, they sent a modest detachment of 80 men into the fray, specifically to guard the Brenner Pass between Austria and Italy. This proved to be quite the mundane affair, as the war just never came that way. And so, with no shooting or stabbing of the king's enemies to be done, the soldiers did what soldiers always do when they find themselves bored. They get drunk and liaise with the locals. They had a grand old time of it, and the lads thoroughly enjoyed their little alpine holiday at the expense of the king's treasury. They enjoyed it so much, in fact, that they made a friend who came back home with them, and thus Liechtenstein became one of the few nations to bring back more men from war than it sent. The man's specifics are hard to verify. Some say he was an Italian defector, and others insist that he was simply a local who had Liechtenstein sold to him by the soldiers and so fancied seeing what it was all about for himself. Whatever his motivation, it's an incredible story. Number 7. A defector to North Korea. When we picture soldiers jumping the wire during the Cold War, we typically imagine them jumping from communism rather than to communism. But while that was the way it usually went, it wasn't always the way it went, as exemplified by James Joseph Dresnok, an American soldier who defected to North Korea in 1962. He did it because he had nothing left to lose. He came from an abusive home in the United States and thus had no contact with his family, and his wife of 2 years had left him on an earlier deployment, and above all else, he really didn't take well to military life. He hated the harsh punishments that often came his way for the many minor infractions that he committed while serving. He took the plunge. For what it's worth, it appears to have actually been the right move for him. He found stable work in North Korea as an English teacher, and from 1978 also became something of a North Korean celebrity, as his complexion had him perfectly suited to be cast as the archetypal American baddie in movies. He eventually passed away in 2016 without expressing a single morsel of regret for his decision. And what's more, his story, while rare, is far from unique, as he was just one of 7 American soldiers who defected to North Korea after the end of the Korean War. Number 8. Stealing a helicopter. What do you do when your enemy has a tardy helicopter that you quite fancy having a look at? Well, you pinch one, of course, or at least that's what the Americans did in 1987 when they wanted to get their hands on an Mi-25, the export version of the fearsome Mi-24 attack helicopter, and they did it in a mission dubbed Operation Mount Hope 3. The operation took place following the 8-month-long Toyota War between Chad and Libya, which concluded in 1987 with a Chadian victory. Post-war, the Libyans left behind significant military hardware, including the Mi-25 helicopter at the Quarry Dome Air Base, and thus the Americans saw their opportunity. The mission was led by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and they utilized MH-47 Chinook helicopters. As for the plan, the aim was simple: get in double quick, hook it up, and get out even quicker. It was executed under the cover of darkness to maintain secrecy and minimize the risk of engagement with any remaining Libyan forces. All went well, and after dumping the helicopter in an airbase in N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, everything was loaded up into a couple of C-5 Galaxies, and the Americans disappeared with their prize. Number 9. The second largest air force. Given that the US Air Force is the world's largest air force with 5,213 aircraft on the books, which do you suppose is the second largest air force? Maybe it's China, as they've been pumping cash into their military a lot lately. Or maybe it's Russia. They surely must have a fair-sized fleet on the go, even with their current difficulties in Ukraine. Certainly, those would be sensible guesses, but with China having 1,992 aircraft in inventory and Russia having 3,864, neither of them quite take the second spot. Bizarrely, it is, in fact, the United States again that takes the title, specifically the US Navy, which currently has 4,012 aircraft in its inventory, such is the insane size of the US military. Number 10. The first machine gun. When asked to name the first machine gun, people will typically point to the Maxim gun, a recoil-operated machine gun invented all the way back in the black and white days of 1884. But what if there was something else that beat it to the post? Enter the puckle gun. From all the way back in 1718, a bad boy of a shooter capable of putting 9 chunky 1.25-inch diameter rounds downrange in a minute, a rate that was admittedly just a smidge under the 600 rounds per minute of the Maxim. But it was sufficient enough for some to say that it was the first machine gun, given how it emerged in the muzzle-loading musket days when a really well-trained soldier could let off 3 rounds a minute. Those who say it doesn't count point to how it operated, specifically the fact that the operator had to manually rotate the cylinder and reset the hammer after each shot, when a true machine gun, to simplify, should just keep firing when you hold down the trigger. So, does it count then? Well, we'll leave that up to you to decide. Number 11. Defenseless nations. Last year, the world spent $2.2 trillion on defense, and with such a crazy amount of cash being thrown about for the sole purpose of acquiring killing machines and training a body of handy sorts to operate them, you'd be forgiven for assuming there would not be a single nation on Earth that would willingly leave itself defenseless by failing to spend even a single cent on an army. And yet, there are 16 countries that do exactly that and instead depend on lucky geography or powerful friends to ensure their protection. The nations in question are Costa Rica, Andorra, Dominica, Grenada, Vatican City, Liechtenstein, Samoa, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Nauru, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Solomon Islands, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. Number 12. World War II tanks in Ukraine. We've all heard about old tanks being dragged out of retirement and returned to service on the battlefields of Ukraine, but such stories usually concern T-55s or T-62s, not World War II vintage German Panzer IVs, and yet that is exactly what happened in 2023. Behold. Now, the armor aficionados in the audience will have already noticed straight away that some things are not right here. It has tracks from a BMP-1, and it's missing its muzzle brake, and yet, despite this, we shouldn't write it off as a replica that somehow found its way to the front lines, as its dimensions, armor thickness, suspension, and return rollers are perfect, as they rarely are on replicas. So then, how did this weird mismatch of a survivor end up fighting in Ukraine? Well, sadly, we don't have a clue, as nothing more has come to light about it since. It could be one an enthusiast owns that was either restored on a budget or just had some whatever tracks thrown onto it to get it going, or it could have been pulled from a museum and quickly bodged together. We just don't know. And yet, despite the uncertainty, there it is, a Panzer IV in Ukraine, clear as day. Number 13. The bazooka scooter. The Vespa 150 TAP was a wacky little thing developed for France's paratroopers back in the 1950s. A bazooka scooter, literally a Vespa scooter with a whopping great 75mm M20 recoilless rifle strapped to it. Built between 1956 and 1959, remaining in service until at least the early 1970s, this weird little thing saw action in both the Algerian and Indochina wars. But alas, we are saddened to report that it wasn't fired on the move, and so rather than zipping about the colonial countryside and dropping tanks in some sort of weird Quadrophenia Full Metal Jacket crossover, the TAP was instead just used to ferry the M20 around all nippy and speedy-like, and when the rider found something he wished to blow up, he'd dismount and set it up on the ground conventionally. Ultimately, the bazooka scooter concept never really caught on and remains a weird little footnote in French military history. Primarily, this was because scooters are really terrible at crossing rough terrain. Imagine Jeremy Clarkson on the Top Gear Vietnam special, then up the ante with people shooting at him, and you suddenly get why this was such a terrible idea. Number 14. He's more mess than man now. In 1944, Finnish soldier Yamato survived a harrowing and quite frankly hilarious ordeal when he overdosed on methamphetamine, popping a total of 30 pills, the supply for his entire unit. What followed was an interesting series of events, with highlights including being so buzzed off his nuts that he began to rocket ahead of his unit, and so focused had the meth made him that by the time he came to his senses and realized it overtaken his men, he was now miles over the horizon and totally on his own. He also skied 62 miles through the forest while completely blackout unconscious and having no memory of his journey or why he did it when he came to. He also stepped on a landmine and came off with nothing but a slightly roughed up uniform, and then he stepped on another landmine that did actually mess him up severely, but thanks to the magic of meth, he pressed on as if he was absolutely fine. He also hallucinated that a mighty tree was in fact a terrifying wild animal, and then proceeded to fight the tree as if his life was at stake. Surprisingly, he survived all of this and eventually stumbled upon a Finnish patrol that immediately raced him to a hospital, from which he was eventually discharged when his heart rate dropped to normal. That was 3 weeks later. Even more surprisingly, he then walked away from the mother of all come-downs totally unscathed and retired in peace after the war, eventually passing away in 1989 at the ripe old age of 71. Number 15. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. John Sedgwick was a Union Army general during the American Civil War. He was born in 1813 and served in many conflicts before the Civil War, including the Seminole Wars and the Mexican-American War. He took to war like a duck to water, and after honing his craft in those bitter conflicts, he was one of the Union's most valuable and respected generals come the onset of hostilities with the Confederacy. On the 9th of May, 1864, during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, he was commanding the 6th Corps. He was at the front lines, directing artillery placements and troop positions under Confederate sniper fire. His troops were ducking for cover, but Sedgwick, wanting to calm them, stood tall and reportedly said, "They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." His final word being cut short by a Confederate bullet which passed straight through his skull and exited through his left eye socket. He immediately collapsed to the floor, dead before he even hit the ground, becoming the highest-ranked Union casualty of the entire war. His death was a cataclysmic loss for the Unionists. He was a key figure in their command structure, a tactical genius that helped formulate some of the Army's greatest plans, and deeply loved by his men for his caring and paternal leadership. For his legacy, however, none of that matters, and today he is defined by one thing and one thing alone: irony. Number 16. The most expensive plane. This is the most expensive plane to ever take to the skies, the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit. It's an advanced strategic bomber designed to be all but invisible to enemy radar thanks to its low, flat profile and wealth of other highly classified stealth technologies incorporated into its design. It has all of this tech for one purpose, and one purpose alone: to be the single most deadly thing in the sky, specifically by brazenly flying its payload of 16 B-83 nuclear bombs right over enemy radar and air defense installations and dropping them wherever it pleases, all but guaranteed that it will not be intercepted while doing so. To put into perspective just how insane this capability is, a B-83 has a yield of 1.2 megatons, making a cumulative yield of 19.2 megatons per sortie, which is 914 times greater than the yield of the Fat Man bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. It is truly terrifying stuff. So then, with capabilities like that, it is a small wonder that the B-2 is the most expensive airplane ever made, but just how much does it cost exactly? Well, adjusted for inflation, the flyaway cost in 2024 dollars works out at just over $4 billion per unit. Or to put it in other terms, about the same as the whole cost of a British Queen Elizabeth-class supercarrier or twice Argentina's entire military budget. Number 17. The Admiral Kuznetsov. Much has been made of the dire strait of the Russian military since its invasion of Ukraine, between a total failure in logistics that saw its advance on Kiev stall to a complete halt in the city's suburbs, having to depend on AliExpress walkie-talkies after corruption ate up its radio budget, and the complete absence of its supposedly most advanced machines, the Su-57 fighter and T-14 tank from the front lines. I mean, we're really spoiled for choice when picking examples here. But, catastrophic as they are, one thing serves as a monument to Russian military failures and delusions better than any other. And that would be their sole aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov. The vessel, originally commissioned for the Soviet Navy back in 1991, has been moored up for overhaul since 2018, and it hasn't exactly gone well. In 2018, the floating dock holding the carrier, BD-50, sank, causing a crane to crash onto its deck, which led to substantial damage. This was then followed by another incident in 2019 in which a significant fire broke out on the ship, resulting in the death of at least one sailor and injuries to 12 others. Further to this, the budget allocated for her overhaul is believed to have been largely swallowed up by corruption. As a result of this, not only has no progress been made on the Kuznetsov, but her condition has only degraded further to the point that today it is believed her engines are totally non-functional and in need of total replacement. And if that wasn't bad enough, just to really rub salt in the wound here, both China and India have Soviet-made carriers of their own, the Liaoning and INS Vikramaditya, respectively, and they both work a treat. Russia really has no one to blame but itself for this one. Number 18. China and the USSR went to war. Well, speaking of the Cold War, two blocks are typically discussed, those being the capitalist West, headed by the US and containing the various capitalist nations of the world under their leadership, and the communist East, which contained all of the communist nations under the leadership of the Soviet Union. But such a lens is actually incorrect, as there were really three blocks in the Cold War, with the third being led by China. And this is where we get the term Third World from today, by the way. It was originally nothing to do with wealth or lack thereof, and it was actually a Maoist term coined to refer to the nations that fell into China's sphere of influence. The Soviet Union and China did used to be friends early on, but they fell out big time in 1960 when ideological differences culminated in the Sino-Soviet split. From then on, in practical terms, they hated each other, and the Soviet Union and China had the same relationship as the Soviet Union and America did. Things escalated so much that come 1969, the two nations were at war. Granted, it wasn't exactly a run to the shelters, the nukes are coming type of war. It was never formally declared, so there were no changes in borders, and it ended 7 months later with no more than 150 people killed and a dozen tanks destroyed. But still, the armies of both nations were shooting at each other, and so it definitely counts. Number 18. The last nation to march under the swastika. Because of the actions of a certain moustached Austrian fella, it's fair to say that the swastika has rather negative connotations in the modern day, and because of this, the ancient symbol of peace and well-being that you once couldn't move all the world over has been all but purged from public view. But one nation's military still marches under it, quite literally, and that would be Finland. Allow us to explain. Despite Finland having been wartime allies of the Nazis, their use of it is actually completely coincidental and predates its adoption by the Nazis, dating back to 1918 when Count Erich von Rosen, a Swedish explorer and friend of Finland, gifted the newly independent country its first aircraft, which was emblazoned with his personal good luck charm, a big blue swastika. Finland's just happened to like the symbol and so continued to apply it to the later aircraft, as well as roll it out more widely. After the war, many branches of the Finnish armed forces decided to phase it out for obvious reasons, but the Air Force stood its ground. It was their symbol long before it was Hitler's, and they would be damned if they were going to let him ruin a tradition that they were perfectly fond of. Despite this steadfastness, the use of it has waned over the years. The roundel, adorning aircraft, was dropped immediately in 1945, and it was then slowly dropped from the banners and insignias of various units as the years rolled on, culminating with it being removed from the Air Force's official logo in 2017. But one unit persists in its use, the Finnish Air Force Academy, and they still march under it to this day, as you can see in this picture. 20. The first aircraft to shoot itself down. There was a peculiar incident on the 21st of September 1956 when a Grumman F-11F piloted by US Navy test pilot Tom Attridge managed to shoot itself down. It happens while Attridge was conducting high-speed tests of the then-new fighter's cannons, specifically while letting the cannons rip during a sharp dive. The rounds, which left the muzzle at supersonic speed, quickly slowed down due to the resistance of the air and followed a curved trajectory downward, a trajectory that Attridge, with his throttle still binned and full afterburners blazing, soon entered himself, causing the rounds to impact his canopy, right engine intake, and nose cone, which led to a total loss of power. Fortunately, the rounds didn't penetrate the canopy, and all of the aircraft's control surfaces were still intact, so Attridge, the skilled pilot that he was happily able to bring his battered F-11F back down to the ground on a glide and make a rather bumpy emergency landing in a farmer's field. He walked away from the crash alive, but the impact left him severely injured and out of the cockpit for 6 months while he recovered. 21. The biggest cannon. The Tsar cannon from 1586, which currently sits outside of the Kremlin Armory in Moscow, is typically cited as the biggest ever cannon. And by caliber, the width of the barrel, this is indeed correct, with it coming in at a mighty 35 inches. But with it weighing in at a mere 40 tons and never having been particularly used, many say that it doesn't really count. With that in mind, may we now present to you the Schwere Gustav from Nazi Germany. This beast weighed an astonishing 1,350 tons, making it a tad heavier than the Tsar cannon, and despite having a smaller caliber of only 31.5 inches, it was 155 feet long compared to the 17.5 feet length of the Russian Forerunner. Its rounds were also much heavier, weighing in at a whopping 7 tons compared to the 1-ton balls that came out of the business end of the Tsar cannon. For these reasons, many argue that the Schwere Gustav is actually the biggest cannon. But who's correct? Well, that's subjective, and again, you can decide. Is caliber everything? The choice is yours. 22. The biggest military. And while we're on the subject of the biggest, which country do you suppose has the biggest military today? The US, perhaps? It's a sensible guess, for sure, given their population and the insane amount of money they spend every year. Or maybe China. Again, a good guess for both of the same reasons. But while those would be sensible guesses, they would also be incorrect ones, as the real answer is North Korea, a country which has 7.8 million people, give or take a third of its entire population, serving in the military, as compared to only about 4 million in China and 2 million in the United States. A few things to note, however, to qualify that figure. In terms of active military, i.e. people who do soldiering full-time, North Korea only has about 1.3 million, a figure which is roughly equivalent to that of the US and places it fifth in that category, with the remainder of its figure being made up of 600,000 reservists, people who do their soldering on their days off, and 5.9 million paramilitary forces. And this because North Korea, whose military strategy is guided by so-called Songun or military-first politics, makes its military the center point of its whole society, so not only do they keep lots of soldiers on the books directly, but their military also permeates into other aspects of society, leading infrastructure projects, education, cultural works, and other things, and the workers that do those tasks are also trained up as soldiers on the side and do their jobs under the military banner. You have to admit, it's quite a smart strategy for a nation that isn't exactly the most popular on the world stage. Would you want to invade a country where basically everyone living there can be handed a rifle and be sent straight to the front lines? Probably not. Number 23, the last British monarch to lead troops into battle. King George II, who reigned from 1727 to 1760, holds the distinction of being the last British monarch to personally lead troops into battle. It occurred during the Battle of Dettingen back in 1743 amid the War of Austrian Succession. At this battle, he led an allied force comprising British, Hanoverian, Austrian, and other troops against the French. Despite being taken by surprise and facing a formidable French army, George II displayed remarkable leadership. Clad in the most lavish garb of the day, he rode amongst his troops, rallying and inspiring them with his presence. But his direct involvement was not merely ceremonial or morale-raising. He actively participated in the strategic planning and execution of the battle tactics, and even got a few swings in on the French himself. Since then, military service has remained an important aspect of the monarchy, and it is an all but unwritten rule that senior royals are expected to serve at some point, with King Charles III doing his time between 1971 and 1976, and the future king, Prince William, doing so between 2005 and 2013. But in terms of actually getting stuck in while wearing the big shiny hat, it hasn't happened since George II. 24. The last head of state to serve in World War II. And while we're on the topic of heads of state at war, let us discuss Queen Elizabeth II. While she wasn't exactly storming about Normandy, lopping off Nazi heads, she did in fact serve in World War II before she took the throne, and so long-lived was her reign that she was the last head of state in the world to have ever done so. It all began at the age of 18 in 1945, when then Princess Elizabeth, who found the whole Nazi malarkey rather irksome, joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, a women's voluntary branch of the British Army. There she trained as a driver and mechanic. Her service was hands-on and saw her get involved in the maintaining of military vehicles, and by all accounts, she was a belting mechanic. Her service continued until the war's end, and she ended the war as a junior commander. The skills she acquired and her experiences during the war left a lasting impact and instilled in her a love for driving, something which is best encapsulated by a little story from 1998 when Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia made a disparaging remark about female drivers as he climbed into the Queen's Land Rover. In response, she decided to show off her army-honed skills and proceeded to drift and slide her Land Rover around Balmoral, much to the chagrin of the prince's now brown underpants. 25. The deadliest battle in human history. The Siege of Leningrad, which occurred during World War II and lasted from September 8, 1941 to the 27th of January 1944, is, by a country mile, the single deadliest battle in human history. The siege itself was fought by an Axis coalition of German, Finnish, and Italian forces in the offense and Soviet forces in the defense. The Axis strategy was simple enough. They hoped to encircle the city, completely cut it off from all supply lines, and pound it into oblivion with long-ranged artillery. The idea was that this would yield a swift, glorious, and above all else safe victory for the attackers who, rather than getting bogged down in slow and brutal street fighting, would just sit back, hold their line, and wait for the duopoly of starvation and bombardment to cause a complete collapse of morale and thus bring about the city's surrender. That simple plan didn't work out, however. Despite coming very close, the Axis attackers failed to fully encircle the city, meaning that just enough supplies and reinforcing soldiers could trickle into Leningrad to keep both hope and resistance alive and well, and a brutal slog ensued from which neither side would quickly surrender. When the siege finally broke, a scene of total devastation was left in its wake. Leningrad itself was little but rubble, and within that rubble, millions of bodies lay, with casualty figures ranging from 1.5 to 5.5 million across both sides, making it easily the single deadliest battle in human history. 26. The last battle of the Roman Empire. Few societies have a martial record as glorious as that of the Roman Empire. For centuries, its mighty legions trod the armies of Europe and Near Asia underfoot and bent the civilians hiding behind them to their whims, all to expand the power and influence of Rome. But the Roman Empire has been gone for a fair old while now, long having been confined to the history books after fate's fortunes turned against it. So, what was the last battle those once glorious and triumphant legions fought? Well, there's actually two answers to that one. The last battle the Western Roman Empire fought, and the last battle the Eastern Roman Empire fought as the empire was split up in 395 AD. For the Western Roman Empire, it wouldn't have to wait long. Its fortunes were already long in the pan even before the split, and come 476 AD, barely a century later, its forces were engaged in the Battle of Ravenna against the Germanic tribes of Odoacer. It would be their last defeat, as 2 days later, Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor, was kicked off of his throne, and the empire formally came to an end. For the Eastern Roman Empire, its fortunes fared significantly better, and it would cling on for another millennium or so. But come the 15th century, as the medieval period drew to a close, its time was also up, its coup de grace being delivered by Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II at the Siege of Constantinople in 1453. 27. The German army still uses Nazi camouflage. Kind of. Way back in the black and white days, the German army was a pioneer in the use of camouflage uniforms, as exemplified by it being the first ever nation to give a standard issue piece of camouflage equipment to all of its soldiers, specifically the M31 Zeltbahn, a rather handy half poncho, half tent thing that came in this rather fetching pattern we're showing you now, so-called Splittermuster, or splinter pattern. The bad moustache man, who arose to power 2 years later, was all about this whiz-bang new camouflage idea, so when the time came to outfit the SS for war, he naturally wanted them to have some too. But seeing as how they were supposedly the best of the best, his own legion of ideologically indoctrinated nutters, he didn't want them to have mere splinter pattern. They needed something that had marked mark them out as being better than everyone else. This led to the development of several unique SS patterns of camouflage, such as Urbanmuster or P-dot pattern and Planetenmuster or plane tree pattern. Now have a look at this modern Bundeswehr soldier in his Flecktarnmuster or Flecktarn pattern of camouflage. The colors are a bit different, but otherwise, yeah. I mean, if it's not broken, don't fix it, we guess. Number 28. Saddam's World War II tanks. During the 2003 US-led coalition invasion of Iraq, some interesting things were discovered among the plethora of modern and Cold War-era vehicles that made up Saddam's tank force, namely a surprising amount of old World War II-era tanks that would have been confined to museums in any other country. But in Saddam's Iraq, they were rolled out to play their part as everything else came crashing down. The Iraqi army, originally established in the 1920s, had received various tanks over the decades, including models from fascist Italy, the United Kingdom, and later the United States, with examples being things such as the Italian CV-35 tankettes, British Vickers, Mark VI light tanks, and Crusader tanks, and they all re-emerged following the invasion. A particularly intriguing find was this German Sturmpanzer II Bison, a self-propelled gun that plonked a heavy infantry gun on an old, even at the time, Panzer II chassis. The extent to which they were used in fighting varied massively. The aforementioned Bison, for example, from the fact that it was pictured in the middle of a desert having been blown up, was presumably used to some degree, but the fact that such old vehicles were pushed back into combat at all, even if just to a limited degree here and there, is still pretty interesting. 29. Russia and NATO nearly went to war in 1999. In 1999, during the Kosovo conflict, a flashpoint of tension nearly escalated into a direct military confrontation between NATO forces, particularly led by the US and UK, and Russian troops. This tense situation arose when Russian forces unexpectedly took control of Pristina Airport in Kosovo, which was strategically important for NATO-led KFOR peacekeeping mission planning to enter Kosovo after an agreement was reached to end hostilities. British General Mike Jackson, in charge of the NATO forces, faced a direct order from US General Wesley Clark to block the runways and prevent Russian reinforcements. However, Jackson, concerned about the potential for a significant escalation that could lead to a direct conflict between NATO and Russian forces, refused to obey Clark's orders. He argued that such an action might trigger a larger, possibly catastrophic conflict, and stated that he would not start the Third World War. Fortunately, the standoff was later resolved diplomatically, with Russian forces eventually participating in the peacekeeping mission, but not under NATO command. Oh, and just a fun bonus fact here, famed English singer-songwriter James Blunt was also there. He was then a captain with the Lifeguards Regiment at the time, and it was the squadron he was commanding that was initially racing to secure the airport when the Russians unexpectedly took control. So there you go. Number 30. The last World War I rifles in service. The Sirius Dog Sled Patrol, a unit within the Royal Danish Army's Joint Arctic Command, operates in the harsh, remote terrains of northeast Greenland. Established in 1941, the unit is tasked with long-range reconnaissance missions and enforcing Danish sovereignty over the vast Arctic expanse. The unit's personnel, hand-picked members of the Danish forces, navigate the icy wilderness in pairs, each duo conducting patrols that can last up to 4 months, accompanied by their sled dogs, and they also have the distinction of being the last unit on Earth to still be equipped with weaponry from World War I. Specifically, they use the American M1917 Enfield bolt-action rifle, and it is their primary means of defense against both any potential villains they stumble across and polar bears alike. The reason for this choice is simple. In Denmark's opinion, nothing modern has come close to doing the job better. The conditions in the Arctic are brutal, and any rifle that isn't made to the best of standards or has even a single blemish in its design simply won't cut the mustard and will inevitably become a useless lump of ice. A condition which is far from ideal when a ton of polar bear has its heart set on making you lunch. And thus, the Enfield soldiers on, waiting for some young upstart to come along that can finally bear the weight of its heavy burden. Number 31. The British SS. Famously, and also ironically, the Nazi SS was one of the most racially diverse organizations to ever exist, with it having units whose members were drawn from all 4 corners of the globe, including those countries that Germany was actively at war with, the most interesting of which is the British Free Corps. It recruited from British and Imperial POWs and was started by John Amory, a rabid British fascist and Nazi sympathizer. Unlike other enemy units of the SS, however, like those representing the Soviet Union, which had upwards of 1 million million men throw their hat into the ring with their former enemy, recruitment was always a major struggle for the British Free Corps, and it never managed to reach more than 27 active members at its peak, with only 54 joining up in total come the war's end. It was founded in 1943 and never took part in meaningful combat duties, even when it found itself attached to the 11th SS Panda Grenadier Division, instead being used far more for propaganda work and infrastructure odd jobs back on the home front. This is itself an interesting deviation from other enemy units, as both the 33rd French and 15th Latvian divisions were heavily involved in fighting on the Eastern Front. Post-war, the Free Corps members were apprehended and some were tried and convicted, with its founder John Amory being executed for treason in 1945. 32. The biggest battleship. Now let's take a look at history's biggest battleship, which would be the Japanese Yamato. Commissioned in 1941, she was a remarkable feat of naval engineering, one designed to counter the numerically superior US Pacific Fleet by taking on multiple battleships at once. Fully laden, she boasted a displacement of nearly 72,000 tons and was 263 meters in length, which, to put it in context, is near to the exact dimensions of a modern British Queen Elizabeth-class supercarrier. Her teeth came from the 9 18.1-inch Type 94 main guns, which were split into 3 turrets of 3, and were also the largest caliber of naval artillery ever fitted onto a warship even to this day. These guns were capable of firing shells over a distance of 26 miles. Despite her impressive capabilities, however, Yamato's operational history was limited. She popped up all over the Pacific, here and there during the war, but was denied the big showdown with the US Navy for which she was designed, and was eventually sent into the drink in April 1945 when she was pounced upon by so many bombers that she just couldn't fend them off. 33. Ice aircraft carrier. During World War II, Britain embarked on a highly ambitious and unconventional project known as Project Habakkuk. The idea was to construct a massive aircraft carrier out of pykrete, a mixture of ice and wood pulp, which promised to be both durable and slow-melting. The concept was born from desperation. The UK was losing far too many carriers in the Atlantic, and you know what they say, desperate times call for desperate measures. The visionary behind this project was Geoffrey Pike, who, with the support of Lord Mountbatten and Winston Churchill, proposed this innovative solution to create unsinkable iceberg-like carriers. Pycrete's properties, being stronger than plain ice and slow to melt, made it an ideal material for such a massive structure. It could potentially revolutionize naval warfare in the Atlantic. A prototype was built on Patricia Lake in Canada, which demonstrated the material's feasibility, but the project was eventually deemed impractical. The challenges, such as the immense scale of construction, the need for continuous refrigeration to prevent melting, and the advent of longer-range aircraft and new technologies, were simply too great to overcome, even in the wacky Wallace and Gromit days of British World War II engineering. Number 34. The oldest military unit. The oldest military unit in the world is currently the Spanish Infantry Regiment Immemorial del Rey. This unit has existed uninterrupted since 1248. It came into being when King Ferdinand III of Castile began maintaining a group of full-time soldiers on his conquest of Seville, one of Europe's first standing armies since the Roman Empire. Needless to say, the regiment has changed quite a bit over the years. It started off as a normal infantry regiment before going through stints as both grenadiers and light infantry, and then settled into its modern role as an honor battalion for the Spanish crown. Think something like the famous boys and girls you see outside of Buckingham Palace in London. They're still proper soldiers who get called up like anyone else, just ones who do lots of marching about in posh uniforms when they aren't deployed. Currently, the regiment is based in Madrid and comprises several battalions and specialized units, including a dedicated honor guard battalion, a support unit, an automobile unit, and a well-regarded regimental band known for its performances both in Spain and internationally. 35. The last cavalry charge. We like to think of cavalry charges as an antiquated relic of the early black and white days, one that had its rude awakening to reality in the face of a World War I machine gun fire and then was promptly confined to the history books. This is kinda true, but what such a summarization misses out is that the idea took way longer to die than many would first imagine, with the final cavalry charge taking place in the closing days of World War II, specifically at the Battle of Schoenfeld in March 1945. It unfolded as the Polish People's Army were progressing into Pomerania, with the strategic objective of reaching the Baltic Sea. Initially, the Polish offensive, which was using tanks and infantry, struggled against strong German defenses, and that's when a bright spark among the Poles said, "Well, sod this," and broke out the horses, utilizing a ravine for concealment before launching 2 cavalry squadrons backed by artillery against dug-in German anti-tank emplacements. Surprisingly, it actually worked a treat, and the Germans turned and fled with their tail between their legs in face of the 4-legged onslaught. They didn't make it a habit, however, and the event went down as a lucky one-off fluke rather than a sign that maybe horses were back in martial vogue. Number 36. An absolute mad lad. We like to think of war as quite the unpleasant affair, and in fairness, on account of all the wanton slaughter, pestilence, and general misery that typically accompanies it, this is a pretty agreed-upon perspective. But it isn't wholly correct, because rather shockingly, there exists a special sort of fellow for whom war and its unpleasantness comes to them as naturally as water comes to a duck. Take Lieutenant General Adrian as an example. He served in the Boer War for the First World War and the Second World War, in the course of which he was shot in the face, head, stomach, ankle, leg, hip, and ear. He was blinded in his left eye, survived 2 plane crashes, tunneled out of a prisoner of war camp, and tore off his own fingers when some know-it-all doctor with a head full of degrees and medical experience insisted that the amputation was unnecessary. Having been through all of that, you might imagine that he'd be a man haunted by his experiences, and that his personal memoirs would read like a reprint of All Quiet on the Western Front. But no. While thinking back on his experiences, he said, "Frankly, I enjoyed the war. Like we say, an absolute unit." 37. Nazis dressed as nuns. Fans of the classic wartime comedy Dad's Army will be well aware of the recurring joke about Nazi paratroopers infiltrating while dressed as nuns. But did you know that this actually happened? To evidence that lofty claim, consider the following quote from The Sands of Dunkirk by Richard Collier, quoting, "Gunner William Brewer and 4 mates are retreating to Dunkirk, were drinking tea near a farmhouse when Bombardier Geordie Allen came doubling white-faced. Did you ever see a bloody nun shaving?" Stealing across the pasture, all 5 men saw what they'd always taken to be the tallest of tales. 2 German paratroopers, white coifs discarded, crucifixes dangling, shaving behind a haystack. Seconds later, the nuns fell dying, riddled with 303 fire, the blood of a dark spreading stain on their black habits. And just to prove it wasn't a one-off, how about this little extract from A Soldier's Tale by M.K. Joseph, quoting, "In Hugo's, a bistro just behind the Place de Palais Bourbon, a startling transformation took place when a nun, who for 2 months had made regular collections among the political clients patronizing the bistro, appeared as a man and a German. As Cocteau pointed out, there were nuns everywhere, since penetrating the disguise was a delicate matter." So yes, Nazi soldiers really were running about dressed as nuns. Number 38. The world's first super soldiers. You can't move for depictions of super soldiers in contemporary science fiction, but did you know the idea has also been tried in real life, with the earliest example coming from the standing in a straight line and politely shooting each other days of the 17th century. More specifically, it comes from Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia, who wanted his favorite regiment, Regiment Number 6, the so-called Potsdam Giants, to be comprised of nothing but absolute units, and thus insisted the absurd rule that every single member of the regiment must be at least 6 foot 2 inches tall. That would be all but impossible to achieve today, so how on God's earth did he manage it all the way back then when, no one had any food, and thus lofty fellows were in rather short supply? Well, you could poach them from other militaries with a big bag of gold, or you could forcibly conscript them, and when that invariably didn't work, you could take the ones you did have and pair them up with equally tall women, and thus the world's first super soldier program was born. Oh, and if you're listening to this and wondering if Friedrich may have had, well, other motivations behind his obsession with big strapping blokes, you'd be correct, as evidenced in the following, when he told the French ambassador, quote, "The most beautiful girl or woman in the world would be a matter of indifference to me, but tall soldiers, they are my weakness." And you know what? Good for you. You're living your best life, Friedrich. Number 39, a rare glimpse of humanity. On the 20th of December 1943, right in the dark depths of World War II, an incredible act of human kindness played out in the skies over Germany. Lieutenant Charles Brown was behind the stick of his trusty B-17 bomber, which unfortunately for him was heavily damaged, having taken an insane amount of flak fire and was swarmed by over 12 German fighters while over Bremen. His plane was just about holding together, but things weren't looking good. His tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Erkenrode, was dead, many more of his crew were well on their way to joining him, and the plane seemed like it was going to fall apart at any moment, with vast expanses of sky now visible through what was once a solid fuselage. One more attack run would finish him. He was certain of it. But luckily for him, the man sent to do exactly that was one First Lieutenant Franz Stigler, a man who, when he dived in for the kill in his Messerschmitt 109, couldn't bring himself to do it. The plight of the stricken bomber's crew was plenty visible, even to him through the damaged fuselage, and so he chose not only to spare them, but to escort them out of German-controlled skies and back to safety, a rare glimpse of wartime humanity in the skies over Nazi Germany. Number 40. The Lusitania was carrying ammunition. You likely learned about the 1915 sinking of the RMS Lusitania in school, one of the many German slights that worked to drag the US into World War II. If so, you were likely told that it was an illegitimate target, as it was serving a purely civilian purpose, and thus its sinking was a war crime. But did you know, since those age-old textbooks were penned, it has come out that it was actually carrying ammunition, and thus was a completely legitimate target by the standards of the day. Speculation on this matter had been rife for years, pretty much ever since the Lusitania sank, but it was finally confirmed in 2014 when a bundle of documents penned by the British government back in 1982 were declassified and released to the public, one of which was a communication between Noel Marshall, then the head of the Foreign Office's North America Department, and a salvage company that wanted to access the wreck, which said the following, quoting, "The facts are that there is a large amount of ammunition in the wreck, some of which is highly dangerous. It could literally blow up on us." This was further confirmed by the releasing of the Lusitania's shipping manifest, which admitted it clear as day. She had 4,200 cases of Remington rifle cartridges containing about 4 million rounds and 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells and fuses in her hold. Number 41. Illegal weapons of war. It's a mad thing, given the pointless wholesale and industrial scale slaughter that was World War I, but did you know there was an American weapon that the Germans found so wanton and barbaric that they actually petitioned their enemy to discontinue its use on humanitarian grounds? But just which one could it be? Because we're really sport for choice in World War I. Poison gas, perhaps? What with the whole dying of burning and agonizing death over the course of many hours as your insides melt from the inside out? Well, no, it wasn't that. Or maybe flamethrowers, as being melted alive certainly isn't a great way to go. No, not that either. It was actually this which was the cause of all that commotion. The Winchester Model 1897, better known as the trench gun. It sounds absurd, given what else was on offer, but just listen to it from the horse's mouth, specifically from a telegram sent by the Germans on the 15th of September 1918, quoting, "The German government protests against the use of shotguns by the American army and calls attention to the fact that according to the laws of war, every prisoner found to have in his possession such guns or ammunition belonging thereto forfeits his life. This protest is based upon Article 23E of the Hague Conventions respecting the laws and customs of war on land." Number 42. General Butt Naked. For between 1989 and 1997, the First Liberian Civil War was a truly horrific business. The conflict resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people, the displacement of countless others, and it left the nation in ruins. Crimes against humanity were also prolific. Child soldiers were the norm on both sides, as were mass killings and rampant sexual violence. Amid this chaos rose Joshua Milton Blahy, better known by his moniker of General Butt Naked. And he's a pretty interesting sort to say the least. He led the Naked Base Commandos, a paramilitary insurgency group fighting on the side of President Samuel Doe. And from what you've heard thus far, would you like to guess the standout feature of their method of warfare? Yep, they did it naked. Well, we say naked. Sometimes they would spice things up by cross-dressing or wearing brightly colored wigs, but for an average day's crimes against humanity, a birthday suit was the battle dress of choice. And now you might be thinking, well, why? Well, let's hear that from Joshua himself. To quote, "I was naked and they are shooting me, and nothing was happening. It was not just psychological, it was the means of displaying my power. When I'm naked, I disappear faster. When I'm naked, I activate my spiritual powers faster than when I had on clothes." As for the crimes against humanity, the naked base commandos had a particular ritual that they liked to partake in before taking to battle, and there's no way to take the sting off this, so we'll just come out and say it. They'd kidnap a random child, kill them, cut out their heart, and eat it. This supposedly would further unlock their spiritual powers, and just in case the nudity and murder didn't grant them enough protection, they would also use a long, pointy medical implement to put a demonetizable tar-like substance into their body in a demonetizable manner. But it gets even weirder than that, because, would you believe it, just as General Butt-Naked's side started to lose the war, he had an epiphany. While he was elbow deep in a child sacrifice, literally, we might add, the good Lord Jesus Christ decided to appear and encourage him to repent for his wicked ways. And sure enough, he did exactly that. He's now a Christian pastor and spends his spare time visiting his victims, who, would you believe it, aren't exactly chuffed to see him. He's basically breaking into their homes and not leaving until they forgive him. You really couldn't make this stuff up. And we know that we've gone way over time on this fact, but we just couldn't do it justice in less. Number 43, Douglas Bader. Because we got a bit carried away with that last one, let's make this short and sweet to write our word count, shall we? During World War II, there was a British fighter ace named Douglas Bader. He was born a great pilot and a fantastic strategist, having both 22 kills to his name and being a huge advocate for the aerial tactics that eventually won the Battle of Britain. That isn't what makes him really interesting. However, what does that is the fact that he accomplished this while having no legs. Number 44, the second highest ranked Norwegian soldier. At present, the highest ranked Norwegian soldier is General Elric Kristoffersen. He is currently head of the entire army and has had a simply glowing career since he first enlisted all the way back in 1988. But commendable though his service has been, we are much more interested in the second highest ranked soldier in that particular army, Major General Sir Nils Olav III, Baron of the Bouvet Islands. Why? Well, because he's a king penguin. Sadly, Sir Nils's rank is only ceremonial, meaning we are unable to tell you all about a penguin who ran around Afghanistan with an M16. He is the product of a Norwegian army tradition dating all the way back to 1961, when the Norwegian King's Guard, while in Edinburgh for the annual military tattoo, popped into the local zoo. While there, one soldier, Niels Egelian, took a particular liking to the penguins and arranged for his regiment to adopt one, which was then named after him. Finding the whole thing rather cute, the regiment decided to treat Niels Olav as if he was a person, which included promoting him every time they were in Edinburgh. This led to the Marshal Penguin's rank getting a bit out of hand over the years, especially when ranks and awards are retained by new Niels Olavs. Oh, and the civilian establishment also found the whole thing rather cute, hence the knighthood and the whole Baron of the Bouvet Islands thing. And that's how a penguin became Norway's second highest ranked soldier. Number 45, the first battle that we know about. Battles have been a facet of human civilization ever since the first cavemen realized that they could impose their will on other cavemen by ganging up and smashing their skulls in. But unfortunately, due to writing not really being a thing for the first 300,000 or so years of human history, we know nothing about the majority of battles that have occurred. So, knowing that, what is the first battle that we know about? Well, that would be the Battle of Megiddo, which occurred on the 16th of April, 1457 BC. It saw the Egyptian Empire, commanded by Pharaoh Thutmose III, squaring off against the Canaanites in the Levant, and it was a thumping victory for the Egyptians, which led to them dominating the region for many years to come. But we don't just know a basic overview of the battle, we also know how it played out in some detail. It saw Thutmose strategically camp his forces near the enemy and launch a surprise attack in the early hours of the following morning. The Canaanites had a high ground advantage, which the Egyptians countered with a clever concave formation and totally overwhelmed them, leading to a glorious and decisive Egyptian victory. We also know the casualty figures, around 4,000 killed and 1,000 wounded on the Egyptian side, and around 8,300 killed and 3,400 captured on the Canaanite side. Number 46, Nazi crackheads. Close your eyes and picture a crackhead. I mean, what comes to mind? Perhaps a stereotypical image of a disheveled fellow on a park bench engaging in all sorts of bizarre behavior as he eagerly searches for his next fix, or maybe an exhausted white-collar financier type who can only get through his grueling 14-hour shifts with a generous serving of vitamin C. Whatever you pictured, we are willing to bet it wasn't the Nazis, and sure enough, they were huge sniff monsters, as narcotics of all sorts were rife in the ranks. The chief one was Pervitin, a methamphetamine derivative issued by the army as an alertness aid. We don't know exactly how much of the stuff was dished out, as such documentation doesn't survive, but we do know that they had 35 million tablets on hand before the Battle of France, and that its issuing continued throughout the war. But Henry Ivers didn't just exist down the ranks either. Hitler himself was also partial to a bit of rocket fuel. Don't believe us? Have a look at this footage of him tweaking off of his nut in the 1936 Olympics. Number 47, the Nazi aircraft carrier. Most of us know that aircraft carriers were a bit of a big deal in World War II, and that Japan, the US, and the UK had a mad amount of them. But what is less well known is that the Germans, typically written off as a middling naval power at best during the war, also had one, sort of. The ship in question was the Graf Zeppelin, and she was part of Germany's ambitious Plan Z, a mass naval building program that was intended to see Germany threaten the supremacy of the Royal Navy, and if finished, would have seen them rocking 4 top-of-the-line carriers. So then, if Germany had her, why do we say that they only had one kind of carrier? Well, that would be because she never actually got finished. She was launched in December 1938 and was intended to carry a formidable air wing of 42 aircraft, including the Messerschmitt Bf-109T variant and the Junkers Ju-87C variant, both of which were specialized naval variants with tailhooks, reinforced landing gears, and all that other good stuff that naval aircraft need. This would have made her a fearsome prospect if completed, but with war ratcheting ever nearer and eventually breaking out, there was always something better to spend the money on than actually completing and commissioning her, and so she sat in port half-finished for the entire war, eventually being scuttled by her own crew in March 1945. Number 48. That time, POWs stole a plane. We all have a good escape story, hence The Great Escape, the 1963 classic depicting the legendary 1944 mass escape from Stalag Luft 3. But our personal favorite concerns 2 Luftwaffe pilots and Second Lieutenant Heinz Schnabel and First Lieutenant Harry Wappler, who really raised the bar for daring when they busted out of Shapwell's prison camp in 1941. Their plan saw them secretly make perfect copies of Dutch Air Force uniforms in the camp and one-to-one forgeries of paper IDs. They then cut the wire with homemade tools and legged it. But that isn't even the audacious part of their plan, because how would they get across the channel? Simple, they'd steal a plane, specifically a Mars Magister trainer from just down the road at RAF Kingstown. Thanks to their uniforms and buckets full of confidence, no one thought anything of it when they marched through the front gate, hopped into the plane, and took off into the sky. Unfortunately for them, they messed up their fuel calculations and so ended up making an unplanned hard landing in a field in Norfolk. They attempted to ride it out and play it cool by keeping up the Dutch shtick, but they were soon rumbled and shipped off to a POW camp in Canada. Number 49. The first steam warship. Most of you will know that steam propulsion completely revolutionized warships in the 19th century. But do you know what the very first steam-powered warship ever was? Hopefully, not many of you, or else this fact will be a bit redundant. The ship in question was the Demologos, and being the first of her kind, her design was a far cry from later established norms. She was a paddle steamer, so far so normal. Where it gets weird is when you discover that a paddle wheel was buried deep within a catamaran hull, that being a style with 2 parallel hulls of equal size. As for a role on the battlefield, she wasn't a ship of the line intended to integrate with the normal navy at sea, but rather was a so-called floating battery, literally just a floating gun platform meant for operation in harbors and shallow waters. This also made her tiny, with a displacement of barely 1,500 tons, although she did carry quite a mean set of teeth in the form of 32-pounder guns and 2 100-pounder guns. As for her speed, that was a whopping 6 miles an hour. Despite being revolutionary, her impact was actually quite limited. The whole world turned around and went, it's a bit of alright, isn't it? We gotta get her some of those. But that was about all that happened, and steam warship development proper wouldn't begin until almost 20 years later. And given the fact that she was first put to sea in 1814, perhaps that's not surprising, as she was way before her time. Number 50. British military slang. To finish us off today, there's a quick review of some fun British military slang from over the years. The civil servant, the SA-80 rifle, dubbed as such because it doesn't work and can't be fired. Fart sack, sleeping bag, dubbed as such on account of what tends to accumulate in it when a soldier is sleeping inside. Crap hat, someone from a supposedly boring and or unglamorous service, often said by the SAS paratroopers and Marines on account of their posh-coloured berets that advertise their actiony roles. Gat, a gun derived from Gatling gun. Note that bang stick, shooter piece, and bullet chucker are also applicable. Bastard wire, barbed wire, used to imply that the individual that laid it is a bastard. Stab, short for stupid TA bastard, is a term that describes an incompetent member of His Majesty's Armed Reserve, formerly known as the Territorial Army. Death stag, a nighttime shift of standing tall at gate guard duty, otherwise known as stagged, dubbed such on account of what it makes you wish for while you are doing it. Exercise blockage, the inability to go to the toilet while out soldiering, and a problem that is often solved by a Thai green curry ration pack. And finally, regimental bath, a group activity that involves buckets of freezing water, Brillo pads, and a liberal squirting of shower gel, all applied forcefully and without consent, performed on gungy blokes who haven't changed their underpants since the invasion of Iraq.